Okay, so welcome to the third edition of the CEC Monthly Exchange webinar. Today's topic is networking and relationship building. And we have a great panel of people here to talk about that topic. And so I will introduce you to them all. First up is David Burton, who is a community development specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. And might I add, a nationally recognized expert on neighboring. And I expect that at the end of this call, you will all go out and knock on the door of one of your neighbors this afternoon or over the weekend, because he won't purposely do it, but you'll feel a little bit guilty for not knowing everyone in your street. Dr. Casey Lacey is a Fulton native, and so we're going to tap her later for insights into Fulton, which is where our upcoming CEC conference is going to be in September. Dr. Casey Lacey is an executive leadership coach. Liz Eggleston is community engagement leader for the Midland Institute for Entrepreneurship, and it's a very, very cool job and such great experiences, which he will tell you about today. Steve Hennis is the senior evaluator at the University of Missouri Assessment Resource Center. Meg Landland is founder and owner of Greater Visions Consulting, which is she's a professional development specialist and a Gallup certified strengths coach. And then Chrissy Salter, I have spoken to her once and I already love this woman. She's down to earth, she's direct, she's very practical. She is a sales representative with image marketing and advertising, and has been around a lot longer than her youthful looks would have you imagine, right? Okay, so as I said, we have a Connecting Entrepreneurial Communities conference coming up in September. It's going to be held in Fulton, and each of these people will be speaking there. So that will be a great chance for you to learn more from them and get into real conversations with them in our networking events. So the first question is, and I'm going to ask this to Casey Lacey. So Casey moved to Fulton 13 years ago from Texas, and Fulton being the destination or the host for our conference this year. Casey, how is networking and building relationships different, or are they even different, in Fulton compared to what you experienced in Texas? In general, how is it different in rural communities to create relationships and network?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So my background, she's an executive leadership coach, but most of my experience has been in higher education. So I've been at large universities, and then last 13 years at a small university. So I'm a psychologist, so love to study relationships. But for me, really looking at those relationships, there are some similarities for sure. But the biggest difference, I think, for me is there's this close-knit community being in a rural setting. And so some of that sometimes takes time to build those relationships. But again, for myself, getting plugged in, especially, with the college and those built relationships with your coworkers, but there's other opportunities to get involved in kind of a smaller community. There's really the importance of visibility, and that's going to be easier in a smaller rural community. So showing up at events, joining your local chamber, again, just being around, whether it's athletic events. I remember starting here, and again, I'm not athletic at all, but we joined a kickball team. And so I got to meet people that way. I actually volunteered to be on a local board. It was our coalition against rape and domestic violence. And so that was a really good experience for me professionally, but also something that I was really passionate about. Word of mouth is big in a rural community. And so again, I think Chrissy can speak to this too, about like how you're branding yourself. People get to know you and what they know about you. And so again, I'll get random phone calls from our county commissioner listener. He's like, hey, do you know anybody that's selling a house? I got someone. And so it's just random connections like that. But again, it takes time to build those relationships. And so being intentional about that, and authentic. It doesn't have to be this forced network, but, getting to know people over coffee, getting to know people, at lunch. My other recommendation would be shopping local, especially in your rural communities. When you're, at Beck's, which I highly recommend for everyone that goes to the conference, it's a great restaurant here in Fulton. Going there, knowing the owners and investing in shopping local allows us to make those connections. I know when I interviewed at Westminster, my lunch was actually at Beck's, and I felt like it was like Cheers back in the day, like everybody knew everybody. And I actually found that very intimidating. But I'm a huge extrovert. And so now I'm that person where I'm at Beck's and I'm saying hello. So sometimes it takes a little bit to get things done. You go to town to do something and you probably end up in 10 different conversations, but I truly love that. And I love being a part of kind of that rural community. Larger universities and larger networks, I mean, cities and stuff have benefits in terms of conferences and, professional events and some of these other things. But again, for myself, it has been just such a huge piece of like professionally and personally, I love being in the rural settings. So I would love to hear others and kind of their thoughts and kind of add into, what the differences that they have seen in those rural versus urban settings.
Man, I want to spend a day with Dr. Casey.
Absolutely.
that we would have so much fun. And something you said really resonates with me. It's when we talk about building relationships in a community or a neighborhood, I call it crock pot neighboring. Becoming a connected neighbor is like a crock pot, not a microwave. It is low and slow. It's long term. And I've used that for a while, and then came across a gentleman out. Golly, I hate to even say this. I'm sorry. University of Kansas. It kind of sticks when I say that, but that's where Jeffrey Hall is at. He's a professor of communication studies there, and he did a long-term study on how many hours or how much time does it take to make a new friend. And it goes back to that whole low and slow idea. He says it takes about 50 hours for two people together to move from acquaintances to casual friends. It takes 90 hours to go from that stage to friend status, and 200 hours before you consider someone your close friend. So you said something there earlier, Casey, just about investing time, taking time and to be in the community and be with people. And that, I mean, that's one of the keys right there. It takes time, low and slow.
Something that Casey said, the word intentionality. In all my experience in networking, you have to be very intentional on what you're trying to accomplish. So I think that's the similarity between successful networkers or connectors within, big communities and the rural communities, that you're going in for a purpose. One of the things I've shared with people, if you're going to go to a meeting, who do you want to meet at that meeting? For all of you going to the CEC conference, is there a particular person at that conference or several people that you can put on your target list that you actually want to go make sure you get in front of, connect with, even just briefly? That's a real key to networking. Who do you want to meet? And then, if you extend that a little bit further, who do you know that knows who you want to meet? Sometimes you can use that route also. We could spend all day on that. In the CEO program that we do, the Creating Entrepreneurial Opportunities program, and for those interested, go to discoverceo.com. But one of the things about that is the model is built to help connect young people to their community, in particular the business community, but other community leaders and people throughout the community. And that's a very intentional program designed to do that. I mean, the course of the CEO model is to get these young people into 40 or more businesses in person, meeting the leadership, having 40 or more guest speakers come into their class. Meeting those people, they develop a local network, and I always say at least 100 or more people they're meeting. They'll meet 300 to 400 people in their community. They'll learn about things they didn't know. So again, the CEO model, that part of it is very intentional with trying to get the young people connected to the community.
That's fantastic. Steve Hennis, MU Assessment Resource Center here, and I just want to ping off of what Dr. Lacey, David, Chris have shared that sense of close-knitness, the going slow to go fast in terms of relationship building, and also that intentionality. Background is in rural sociology, and I grew up in small towns, and definitely can relate to the things that have been shared. And maybe a couple of things to add to is there's sort of that degree of informality, perhaps more in smaller communities than in more urban areas. And I think we've heard it said too that oftentimes the same people are sharing or overlapping many different roles. You might be the soccer coach, you might be, the chamber committee chair, you might see people at church. And these types of settings provide a lot of opportunities to get to know people in many different contexts, but also ultimately talk about yes, family, but also talk about business, talk about ideas and dreams and entrepreneurial ventures. So I think there are some advantages that rural communities offer when we talk about entrepreneurial networking and people who are champions or supporters of entrepreneurs. By and large, since there are probably smaller hierarchies in a lot of our rural communities in terms of organizations, you have better or greater access to leaders compared to urban settings. I know some of the interviews that I was able to do of CEO communities, as Chris described, an insurance agent mentioned that they could pick up the phone and ask for a favor or set up a mentoring visit, just that quickly, which I'm guessing does not always come as easy in our more populated areas. One other thing that stood out is just that people emphasized during these interviews, just a willingness to help of rural entrepreneurs, rural leaders, if they're asked. By and large, they're more than willing to provide time to young people or young adults who've got an idea, share their experiences, share their successes, but also share their failures and their vulnerabilities, which I found amazing. So I think, as we're thinking about the CEC conference, and we're also thinking about our roles in our communities as champions of entrepreneurship, that these are some things that could be advantages to see in a new light.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that when we farmed outside of Fayette, we were unfortunately hit by a tornado that took down our large barn and several fences and killed a cow and all kinds of things around us. And we were in shock that it had happened. And my mother-in-law was with us at the time, and we were equally surprised when a whole row of pickup trucks pulled up, and they loaded all the hay that was exposed, that was previously in our barn and was just sitting out, and could be ruined by rain. They loaded up all that hay and they took it to a neighbor's barn. And I was just shocked because I grew up in the city where this would not happen. And my mother-in-law said, quick, we've got to make hamburgers for these people. So we fried up hamburgers and we fed them. So it was kind of that reciprocal relationship, but it was, something that came straight from their hearts. And I don't think it would have happened in a large city. Let's just put it that way.
That's such a good point. And Steve, that was such a good addition of like those overlapping of roles. And I think Meg, you put a good spin too, especially with tragedy. I know that we personally saw that during the time of COVID. And so when we're going through difficult things, that is a huge benefit of being a part of a small community. I was the unfortunate person who drew the short straw at the college, and I was the chair of our COVID task force. And so that was fun. But because of those relationships I had built in the community, I was able to call, our director of our health department or call the commissioners or figure out. And that was really helpful for us, especially when we're looking at, resources, financial, or trying to find masks or, what are your protocols? I mean, the health department actually physically came to our campus and walked around and helped us set up the space so we could reopen in the fall. And again, that's such a good point, Stephen, of like how you have those relationships and you can do that. There's that accessibility that is just, I think, unmatched when it comes to kind of a larger community.
There's a conversation directed me to the old thought of there's givers and takers, and an important part of networking and connecting is to be a giver. So something I love to tell CEO kids when I have the opportunity to speak to classes is, who do you want to stay connected to? Because encourage them that they're going to meet all these people, but they're not going to really be connected to them long term unless they intentionally do it. And then, who look at it two ways: who can provide value to you, but also who can you provide value to? And that gets them to realize, hey, that's somebody that I could go to work for. They have a need for something that I either, especially for young people, that the career they might want to go into, or a field. For us as adults, who can we help out? At the conference, for instance, if somebody comes up with a question and they ask a panel in one of the sessions or something like that, and you've experienced them they were asking about, seek that person out and provide them with your personal knowledge of what you went through to try to help them out. And likewise, be sure to ask questions yourself of people that may have that knowledge that you need to help you with something you're going through.
Oh, everything you say there, Chris, just totally, Chrissy, I'm about to throw to you because it reminds me of the conversation I had with you about when you're doing sales. It's about how can I solve your problem, not what can I take from you, right?
Yeah, my favorite thing to say is that people want to be bought. They don't want to be sold. They want questions. They want you to invest in them. They want you to invest in their dreams. They want you. How are you going to know those things if you don't ask questions? How are you going to know those things if you don't have a genuine concern for their welfare, of where they're at and where they want to be? Nobody wants to hear about you. They want to talk about themselves. I mean, and how are you going to offer a diagnosis or a prescription if you don't have a diagnosis to the problem? You got to spend some time listening. And I forget who it was that said, but you have to spend, it was Mr. Good Neighbor over there. You have to spend and by the way, I went to KU, got my degree from there. So you are not building your good neighbor friendship very well, sir.
I really want to focus on Missouri,
I can't help but add, was it Robert Frost that said good fences make good neighbors? So there's some boundaries here between MU and KU, right?
It's okay, good neighbor. I won't hold it against you. But it's true. I mean, some of the best relationships you have only come after you've established trust, and people don't trust you unless they genuinely know that you have a concern about their welfare and that you're there for them. You're not just trying to sell them something.
I got that early on. You're a solutions provider. You're providing solutions to people's problems, challenges, needs, wants, or desires, whatever it is. And that's the approach that I luckily learned from my mentors early on.
I love that you used the word trust there. Ironically, Robert Frost's poem is about not needing fences, actually. Yeah. People reference that all the time as like a reason to build fences, but that's not what the poem's about at all. No. And but I loved Meg's story because it reminds me of a lady here in Southwest Missouri that moved into Highlandsville in a very, very rural area, and she wanted to build connections. And so she decided to do a cookout, and she took around flyers at all different farms. The nearest one to her was a mile away, inviting people to come to their cookout. She'd only lived there a year, but she had neighbors that had lived there for decades, and they didn't know each other. They'd never gotten together, and she had 32 people show up. While they were there in a captive audience, she said, let me get your name and your contact information, your phone number, and I'll put this little directory together for this very, very rural area of Missouri. And it was the following week that one of the neighbors had a fire. And she was able to use that directory to contact neighbors most of whom beat the first responders, the rural fire department there, and helped her find her dogs and look after her livestock. So similar to what Meg was sharing, I mean, that's a good reason to build those connections for. They can be your first responders, or you may just want to build those connections for prevention of future problems.
It strikes me too that the quality of relationships that one builds determines, really quality of life, how far one can go with an entrepreneurial idea or venture, and how successful they will be with that venture. And Chris, I think, echoing some things that you have talked about through the CEO program and how a real world entrepreneurial learning program like that, really teaches young people those basics of, how do you develop a relationship based on reciprocity and rapport. How do you, make eye contact, shake a hand, start a conversation? Some of these skills that, we, I'm sure, exercise and use regularly, but we might take for granted, but we know that are really essential when we're talking about the development of entrepreneurs, and especially early entrepreneurs as they're getting their start. One other thing that stood out to me is, like not all relationships are, the same. The content of those differ. And one piece that I came across that really seemed to nail it well, define different relationships as like lifelines. They're those one-on-one relationships we have for personal support. When it comes to young people, also relationships that are navigators, those people who help them navigate systems, whether it's applying for college or landing that first job, or landing, that angel investor equity, or also door openers. Those people who literally open doors or have access to resources that, say, entrepreneurs need. So a lot of different ways it seems like to think about relationships, but it just comes back to that notion that they are important, they matter. And if one is pursuing an entrepreneurial dream, should really practice, rehearse, and repeat those building skills.
That's getting into your area, right, Meg? With the that's what you do firsthand, is teach people those skills.
Yes, I gave a webinar this Tuesday morning to the Missouri Women's Business Center about communication skills for women entrepreneurs. I'm part of a group that meets every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock via Zoom. And we have different themes for the month. And this month is confidence in women. And so I talked about being an entrepreneur and the different types of communication settings you can find yourself in. If you have a table at a fair, talking to people there, or maybe it's doing business over the internet or approaching new potential clients and how to handle that. So that was a very interesting session. And one thing that came up was the anxiety that a lot of people feel and experience. And Casey knows this very well. So, it was not just a matter of how do you make conversations at a get together. It was also, how do you feel that you can handle it? And if you just have a goal of one person, of meeting one person, if you have a lot of social anxiety and it's difficult to go to the event itself, then set your goal according to what you would feel good about accomplishing. So that was one learning point for me, because I often suggest, well, go to an event and have a personal agenda, as Chris talked about, where you want to meet so many people. But some of them said 3 people meeting at an event, new people, would be too anxiety provoking for them. So we talked about setting lower expectations and still putting yourself out there, which is important. I wanted to just say something about the difference maybe in communicating and getting new clients in rural communities versus urban communities. One thing I've noticed is that in a small town, and Fayette is the only small town I've lived outside of, although I worked in Fulton for many years and I commuted from Columbia. So I'm familiar with Fulton too, but it seems like people can communicate a lot easier through things like flyers and also word of mouth. So yes, you have fewer resources, but if you want to get something done, there's such a great network of communication there. If you say need a babysitter and you tell a few people about it, chances are that problem's going to be solved quicker than if you're part of a larger community, because people really do work together to help others. That was one thing I noticed about Fayette, is they jumped into action if I had a need. And I remember once I went to the hardware store after being at the bank, and I got somebody at the hardware store said, you need to get up, you need to buy something here. It was nails or something. because the bank called us because your husband knew you were going to the bank. And so the bank knew you were coming here. So here I was at the hardware store getting a notice that to pick up something. And that's another example of how the communication network, I think, is much tighter in a smaller community.
I want to tell you a quick story about the building that I'm in right now. We're currently at our office and other facilities. We're hosting our new facilitator training for approximately 20 new facilitators and CEO programs. So access to the internet and a quiet place to do this so very important call that Annette invited me to. I wanted to find another location. So here in Effingham, the building I'm in is called the Exchange, but it was built by young man named Michael Brummer. Michael was in the second ever CEO class, and he moved away from the community for several years after that. Lived in some big cities, had this idea to bring something back to the community. And he's a true entrepreneurial spirit, but he's trying to figure out what can I do in the community. And he decided he wanted to build a co-working space that he'd only seen in big cities, but not a small town like Effingham. And it was in that process of doing that he reached back out to that network he'd built a few years earlier during the course of CEO, because he had to have, bankers and financiers. He had to have this building was vacant at the time, turn it into something. So he had to have all those connections, contractors, you name it, whatever you could do to put something into a building like this. And he converted his first job, he converted the second floor into 4 apartments, which are now Airbnbs, which Steve and I have both stayed at various times, doing work with CEO. And then the ground floor is the Exchange. I'm sitting in what they call the studio, but there's a booth and space here that he's built in. There's private rooms. There's even the old bank vault's still here that you can meet in. He has table and chairs. The door's propped open. I am afraid to meet in there because I don't know if he has a combination or not. And currently, he's also trying to turn the basement into a speakeasy type setting with another business partner that he was, another CEO alum and the connection in the community. So you're seeing real results from these connections. We're talking about making connections, but it's like this can have a real impact, not just on the people, but also on your community, to have a place like this go from vacant to, fully filled with other activity, drawing people to the community, generating revenue, tax dollars, et cetera. It's more than just the connection. It's how you use them.
I love that story, Chris. I just wanted to comment too. I'm so grateful for people like yourself and Meg and, people that are working with our youth to kind of build those skills, working out of college, like Stephen had mentioned earlier too, you see that when it comes to building relationships, it really is a skill and you can learn it. There's a lot of anxiety and there's technology that gets in the way. I love the students always like in their phone as they're walking across the street, and I'm very nervous they're going to get ran over, but I'm like, look out, there's a lot of life going on. So I think especially for our youth and those programs and that skills. And for those of you that don't know, Meg puts on an amazing etiquette dinner. I had the privilege of attending with my husband. He truly thought he was going to go to the event and just ride my coattails, and he had to sit at his own table, and he learned a lot. So I think the more that we can do to really, build those skills, teach people, get past the anxiety of what it's like to have a conversation or build relationships. And, David, your research, I love hearing that the amount of hours, and it is that slow burn, but just making authentic connections and having conversations, realizing people are people. Because a lot of times too, we put people on a pedestal, and that anxiety or fear of our perceptions of what they are also then affects, our willingness to interact or how we interact as well. We can get nervous. So again, so grateful for those of you that are, working with our youth to build those skills, because it's going to be really important for our future.
Right. And Casey, you and your husband did great. But I think
I did great. I don't know about him, but he was okay.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he did. But anyway, the important aspect for any dinner like that or any interaction is to build rapport. And I know, Chris, and those of you that work a lot with communication skills, that's the important thing for people to understand. It's not, how you hold your pinky or whatever when you drink a cup of tea. It's have you met somebody new? Have you learned something? Have you helped other people feel comfortable? And this is getting back to the idea, it's not only giving, it's not only taking, it's giving. So that's really an important thing. And I think the smaller communities are an ideal place to kind of foster that and build upon that more, because people do pull together, and they do tend to be open to really some great ideas. I was a counselor for Lutheran Family and Children's Services for over 5 years, and I did flood counseling up in Brunswick, Missouri. And I couldn't get over how open those rural people were to new ideas, to trying new things. Just a fantastic kind of response from them to people coming in to help them rebuild their community.
I love so this talk about the etiquette dinner is not only making me hungry now, but it just reminded me that, David, don't you use doesn't your wife have a very good talent for making cookies, and you use those to meet your neighbors? Am I right there?
You're right. When I realized that we didn't know the names of our neighbors and some of them lived there a long time, we decided it was time to eat crow. And I'm a little more of an extrovert, so I was willing to knock on doors and hand over our contact information and tell neighbors we wanted to do better. But I knew I needed to take a gift with me, and I had my wife make plates of chocolate chip cookies. And people sometimes say it doesn't sound like that big a deal, but my wife makes really good chocolate chip cookies. And so the idea of handing them over, I had a little bit of an internal struggle about that. But everybody was very gracious and receptive, but still it was slow. No neighbor in that moment said, "Oh, here, let me give you my contact information back." This was just the door opener to establish trust. And some, reciprocated quickly, but I had one that took a couple of years before I ever had his cell number or a way to get a hold of him.
So what you're saying, David, is that and Annette, we'll have chocolate chip cookies at the CEC conference for everybody who registers right now.
We can. I think I told Annette too. One of the ladies that's a neighbor who's a widow, she cracked the door open. I told her what it was. I was giving her cookies, and she said, "How much do I owe you for these?" I mean, it's in some areas, in some communities, it's a lost art. Even having someone come and check on you or try to establish a friendship. So much loneliness and isolation.
There's connection around organizations too, when you think about it, that really can drive things like, think in small communities, chambers, sometimes it's the schools, the sports activities, and CEO, it's driving the students connecting with the business community in particular, but it's the business community connecting with the next generation. It's the business community gets involved with CEO connecting with each other, and that might be the route through which they build connections. The CEO alumni stay in contact with each other, build lifelong networks with some of their classmates in CEO, and sometimes even just in other classes. We have CEO classes in different areas connecting with each other and building more relationships. So utilizing that. And I know I mentioned kind of in Michael's story about this building, but the whole idea of having that connection through CEO, because any CEO student or alum can go into anyone in their community or even pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I met you when you came and spoke to our CEO class, or when we came to your business for a tour. Can I ask you some questions?" And because of that connection, all those business people in the community are more than willing to help the next generation, the young people. But the young people have the permission and a little bit of confidence built because they can just use the word CEO within that to open that door a little further. So the person knows they're not just talking to a random, kid in the community. They're actually talking to someone they've previously connected with through that.
You have me curious. So, there's so many different reasons to engage and build those networks, from having a collaborative space like the Exchange in Effingham to chocolate chip cookies and knocking on the neighbor's door. I'm curious, perhaps what you're all seeing in terms of rural communities and how they're able to bring entrepreneurs together. Some may have the resources and the liberty to have a dedicated space. Others, it might not be a physical location, but more something that's informal or more invisible. And I know, like, for instance, Casey and Meg, I think you mentioned that you have both started your own companies here within the last few years. And so maybe were there ways that you encountered or were able to access, other entrepreneurs through those processes, through those processes?
I think it's a great question. I mean, for me, it's our local chamber. I'll make a huge plug for them. They do an amazing job. They have a business breakfast, so you can go to those things. They have ribbon cuttings for all the different organizations. And so that's a huge thing. But like I said earlier, like joining local boards, knowing the organizations within your community that are kind of the I don't want to say more prominent ones, but they're just more active. So our Rotary is very active, our United Way, Card V. I mean, there's just different organizations like that. And then also at one of our facilities here, they do a business, I think it's monthly, where they do like a tabling event. So those are things where it's just, there's an opportunity to network in a different way. So that's what I've seen, Meg. But I would love to hear Chrissy's perspective on this too, in terms of like what she's seen and how, those businesses can get connected, because I love the cookies. Cookies always make people feel good. And you had really talked about kind of that wellness piece, and for wellness, it's, how you make people feel. That's really what builds that kind of relationship. And so from a sales perspective, I would love to hear Chrissy's expertise as well after Meg kind of tells her story. So.
Okay. Well, I just mentioned the Missouri Women's Business Center. That is very helpful, and that's through the Community Action Center. They've joined forces with them. But I'd say also my communications with my husband's field, he's been in real estate for years. And so I've been working with some of the banks and title companies and things like that that have been customers of his. But I know that Fayette has had a fair for people that I believe are having their own businesses, but I know for sure they've had a table there, several tables where children can set up and sell their own things. So whether it's beads, beaded necklaces or whatever, I really thought that was a great thing that Fayette was doing for their young entrepreneurs. So I'll let Chrissy talk about her business. That would be interesting to hear.
Honestly, it's great to talk about interaction and positive interaction and exchange, but I think the real thing that keeps people from wanting to step out there is their fear of rejection. And I can't speak on that, because I find myself a lot of times I'll go home and think I'm not gonna go to work tomorrow. That was too much to handle. And I think that especially with young people, when social media is a default and you can create a persona that isn't real, and then you go out into the world and you meet people and you do not get the expected response that you intended. Did you meet 3 people today? Yeah, I met them and they were all mean to me. They didn't respond like I thought that they should respond. I offered a great information. I think that's my biggest concern. And one of the things that I'm curious of from each of you, what you would say to how we help people process rejection, because that's where the anxiety comes from. For me, I know, and for people that I work with, other sales execs, I ask them, okay, so what's the worst that can happen? How bad is that rejection that it's going to lead you to not wanting to do it anymore? Possibly, yes. But is it going to kill you? I mean, really, it's going to burn, but can you get back in there and do it again? And I think that's one of the things that keeps people from integrating. And that's one of the things that, because people don't react the way that we expect them to. We think, if I present this to you this way, this is a natural reaction, and you don't get that reaction. Now, how do you digest that? Mm-hmm. It's difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles I see with people trying to make it in the world, is that they don't know how to digest being not rejected, but just not getting the response that they intended when they presented. So I think that's a great topic for discussion, because again, I think that that's what keeps people home and safe.
I love that topic. Yeah. I mean, as a psychologist, that's something that we've definitely talked about. And there is resilience. I mean, it's teaching people resilience, but it's also reframing that, okay, if you got rejection, why? How can I learn from that? And I always talk about like you actually learn more from a failure than you do a success. And so how do you unpack that? But there's a lot of psychology in regards to people's, their perceptions of themselves, self-efficacy, do I have the confidence to do this? And so there's that internal, external validation. How much are they able to validate who they are as individuals? But then also external, what are they getting? And there's so much confirmation bias too, of like when we're looking at, we have all these negative thoughts, our minds are just naturally negative. And so we're looking for the world to confirm that. And so we're just gathering all this evidence and we go and have this interaction like, oh, that was awkward. I ruined that. That was stupid or whatever we want to say. And so I think we have to be really mindful of that narrative that's inside our head and what we're consuming. And especially with our youth, when it comes to social media and other things, especially young women, I really see that too. There's definitely some dynamics when it comes to kind of the gender piece of that as well. So I love you bringing up that topic.
Oh, I was just going to quickly agree that I think reframing failure is one of the more significant parts of the entrepreneurial mindset. And that played out in a pre-post test survey that we were able to do with CEO alums, Chris's program over the past 15 years. That was one of the biggest changes that they experienced over the course of that year-long class was being more comfortable with failure, coming to expect it, recognizing that it's a part of the learning process. And I connected that to other stories I've heard. I think entrepreneur stories also can really help young people grasp that. One example is a couple of MU students who a number of years ago were starting a granola bar business here in Columbia. And at MU Build a Business Camp, we had middle school and high school students, interacting with them, kind of building their social capital through, interacting with actual entrepreneurs. But these two students said, we called 37 restaurants in Columbia, Missouri, asking for use of their kitchen after hours. And guess what we heard? The answer was no. However, the 38th restaurant we called said yes, and that really stood out to the students. You just have to have that persistence. You have to believe in the idea and expect that not everybody's going to be as excited about it as you. But ultimately, you get to that point and there's a great breakthrough.
There's Steve, this flows from what Steve just said. There's a saying I learned a long time ago in sales and marketing is some will, some won't. So what next? And that came from one of my mentors, and it's just a case. That's how you have to approach it. But going in with that, getting back to what Christy was talking about, it's tough sometimes. I spent my entire life on stage pretty much in front of audiences, and some audiences are going to love you. Some aren't going to love you so much. You want them all to love you, but you have to have, there's a certain toughness, but part of like the quote rejection is what are they really rejecting if they're rejecting anything? And you have to separate it. Hey, they don't like my idea or my business or my product or service right now. That's kind of the mindset that I have about it. They're not ready for this right now. They're not rejecting me personally. That's a hard switch to understand, though, especially for people newer in sales, newer in business. They think they're being rejected, especially when you're an entrepreneur, because you're so tied to your thing that, oh, they don't want this. They're rejecting me. And you have to, and it's a hard, it takes time to separate yourself. I'm not a psychologist. I can't give you all the ins and outs of how to do that. I've just learned it over time with reading lots of great books and having my mentors and trainings and things like that. But the third part of all this that comes in because of my direct marketing background is it's all about testing. So if you have an approach, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's not even really a failure. It's you get a result. So you try something and you get a result. Sometimes it's a great result. Sometimes a mediocre result. Sometimes it's not a result that you want at all, but you were testing it. That tells you, hey, maybe that approach doesn't work. Maybe this offer in front of this potential customer doesn't work, whatever it is. You just have to keep going. Like Steve was talking about, get to the 38th one that'll finally say yes.
Really sorry because Chrissy, you've lit everyone on fire. We all want to jump in on this, and I can see, like Jackie, we got to schedule in the new year a webinar on just coping with rejection. But I want to go around each of you all now of our panelists and hear what's your key takeaway that you got from somebody else on this panel. For me, I'm as a researcher. my mind is going 90 now, because 110 speed, because a lot of entrepreneurs we know there is a significant relationship between ADHD and entrepreneurship, right? That a high number of successful entrepreneurs have ADHD. People with ADHD, I'm one of them, also have the tendency to have what is called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is a condition, I'm reading from the internet now, a condition that can cause people to experience intense emotional pain when they feel rejected, criticized, disapproved of, or failed. So that makes me think about what is it that these entrepreneurs who have ADHD, what strategies are they using to overcome rejection, especially when they might have this heightened sensitivity? So that's my takeaway today. But David, what's your main takeaway today?
That I'm excited to be in Fulton this fall to network, build connections, see everybody in person, and to not just tell a few more stories, but to also hear some great stories as well.
My takeaway is that we need to all get some cookies from David's wife. No, I think again, it was just lovely to hear everybody's, different experiences, and really looking at the benefits of a rural community. And so for me, my biggest takeaway is just more gratitude from where I'm at and just the opportunities that are here in our community and also our state. So,
it's the thought is older thought, but it came from David talking about cookies. It's the idea of giving value first. If you provide value without any immediate expectation of anything back, just give value first. In business, what value can we deliver to people who could be our prospective clients? What can you give to your neighbors, like David did with the cookies? On and on, but give some kind of value first for people before you expect anything in return, and give it selflessly.
I think what stands out to me from listening to the panel today is there's really, a diversity of rural communities. They are not all the same, however small, medium size, but very, very different, very, very diverse. And also I'm hearing a great diversity of opportunities to engage entrepreneurs and to build networks, from, again, chocolate chip cookies knocking on the door to etiquette dinners to collaborative spaces downtown and everything in between. And I think what stands out is sort of this in earnestness about becoming more purposeful, about building that social capital. And then for me as an evaluator, I see that communities measure what they value, and they probably also tend to value what they measure. So the challenge to me is to keep working on ways to maybe measure relationships and connections and what difference they make, for us individually, but also for our rural economies.
I think the biggest takeaway from my perspective is something that I thought after the comments about the fear of rejection. I thought, yes, that's true. A lot of people have it, but also I think this generation wants more feedback than maybe previous generations. So really, it's an opportunity to give feedback. Then if things are not exactly as you had hoped, or there's areas for improvement, then to share with them how they can improve. And recently I hired an intern from the University of Missouri Business School. I took on the opposite role that I'd had for years at Westminster, being with the Career Center. I became an employer, and I interviewed 3 students, and 2 of them did not do very well on their interviews. And so I asked them if they'd like some feedback. And yes, they did. And one of them contacted me later and said, I've joined this group, and, thank you so much. And it just brought to my mind how important it is to give feedback, of course, in a constructive and sensitive way. But that's something that maybe we can all do within our communities is to, give that feedback so they can improve.
Yes, I definitely agree about the feedback. That it gives somebody a great opportunity to learn. And what I've learned today is that I had no idea that such great minds, this panel, were thinking about the things that I think about all the time. But have a lot more to offer than I do in regards to studies and information and history and experience. I think I'm going to learn a lot, and I'm super excited about that. But more specifically, I was taking away from David the study that he had on how long it takes to build a relationship. Geez, that's a long time to make a friend. And so it just goes to show you that that where you put your time and effort is really important. And I had not perceived it like that as such. So thank you for that.
Okay, so thank you to all our panelists. Yes, I agree, Chrissy. This is a mastermind group here. What a great session. My brain is ticking away, and I'm very excited to continue conversation when we meet in person in Fulton in September. But I'm off now to create a spreadsheet to keep track of all the hours that I'm spending with each of the people I know, to see if I am yet a close friend or just simply an acquaintance.
Well, your dogs want to know if they're included on that spreadsheet, because they do get an hour a day.
Yeah, so yeah, they do get an hour a day. That's right. So 365 hours. So what does that make them? Where is it? 200 hours is the close friends?
That makes them your biggest fan, is what that makes them.
I was just going to ask David if there is an indicator or a measure. If you know all of the pets' names of your neighbor, is that some indicator that you are a good neighbor? I don't know. I'll have to think on it. But
it's a great opener segue. In fact, last night we were walking the dog, and the gentleman was coming toward us. I know his dog's named Ginger. My wife was with me, and we were all like, "Oh, hi, Ginger, hi," had a conversation. And he walked past. My wife says, "You don't remember his name, do you?" And I said, "No." No, I'm going to have to look it up.
Well, on that note, I'm off to make my spreadsheet, but first I'm going to go and do some networking at the dog park here in Columbia. It's amazing if you haven't been there before. And yes, I'll see all of you guys in September, and make sure to join us for July 5th to hear Beth Snyder speak with Jackie. Thank you, everyone.